Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report, co-sponsored by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Shorenstein Center on Press, Politics, and Public Policy at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I'm Marvin Kalb, a senior fellow at the Shorenstein Center. We're being carried live by WMAL Radio and by C-SPAN, and we're generously funded by the Knight Foundation. Our topic, the war in Iraq, journalism's role and responsibilities. The coverage of this war is like no other in American history. It is for the most part live and in a way inescapable. A new generation of technology is at work. It's also remarkable because of the new Pentagon strategy of embedding more than 500 American and foreign reporters with the troops, producing coverage that is up close, immediate, similar in a way to Ernie Pyle's coverage during World War II. And yet the coverage overall seems contained and amazingly self-disciplined, as though reporters suddenly appreciate the dangers soldiers routinely face in war. We see, as it said, slices of reality, and sometimes we're all a bit puzzled. A number of questions flow naturally from this type of coverage. One, for example, Geraldo Rivera of Fox News was cut loose today from his position because he was charged with giving too much information about his unit's exact position. How much is too much and who makes that call? Second, reporter Peter Arnett was fired today by 3 different organizations. NBC, MSNBC, and National Geographic. The reason was he gave an interview to Iraqi television in which he seemed to be critical of the U.S. government. Supposing he had done the same interview for NBC, would he have been fired for that? Supposing he had done it on Al Jazeera, the Arab television network, would he have been fired for that? Are networks perhaps afraid of public or government criticism? Third, should American journalism be more sympathetic to American policy during wartime? 4, the cost of covering this war. Is there going to be a point where networks and newspapers say to themselves, enough, it's getting to be too costly? Will the cost of this war hurt the coverage of the next war? A question. And finally, have we learned anything from the coverage so far? These are not easy questions, so we've invited an exceptional panel to try to answer them. To my left, Tom Wolzien, who is the senior media analyst of Sanford C. Bernstein and Company. I'm obliged to say at this point, a quote, Bernstein and/or its affiliates have investment discretion over greater than 1% of Viacom. In truth, I haven't the faintest idea why I was asked to say that, but I've just said it anyway. I can tell you. For 16 years, Wolzien worked for NBC News, where I first met him. In 1980, Tom Wolzien wrote a fascinating article that predicted that within 5 or 10 years, 1985-90, there would be live coverage of war, he said in 1980. He was right on target, but slightly off on the timetable. To my right, Bill Plant, White House correspondent for CBS News. He's been working at CBS since 1964. This is one guy who can hold a job. He's covered wars, political conventions, you name it, Plant's been there. The winner of many prizes and an old and dear colleague of mine. To my left, David Sanger, the White House correspondent for the New York Times, where he's worked for 20 years. He's covered Japan, Korea, the theme of globalization as chief economic correspondent, and now the Bush administration. Probably never realized it would be this exciting when he took the assignment. And to my right, Victoria Clark, the Assistant Secretary, I was dazzled by her beauty. The Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, responsible for all matters concerning public information at the Department of Defense, including the embedding of journalists. She comes from a career that has been divided between government service for the first and second Bush administrations as well as the field of public relations. And I would like to start with Tori Clark and then invite the journalists to come in on the issue of embedding, and then turn to Tom Wildzine to find out about the cost of this whole issue. So, Tori Clark, whose idea was embedding?
You know, I'm tempted to say that old saw about success has 1,000 fathers. And it's an idea that has been in place for some time. If you've watched how Secretary Rumsfeld has run this department and how people like Chairman Myers and General Franks have operated, they've always said, let's get as much news and information as possible out there. There's been more access to leadership in the Department of Defense than you've ever seen in history. And even in difficult circumstances in Afghanistan, we had as much coverage as possible. So it's always been the policy, it's always been the practice. When Rumsfeld and Myers and Franks and others were putting together the war plan, and last summer and last fall, the contingency war plan, one of the things they all recognized was the importance of information in both a positive and negative sense. So planning for this kind of robust embedding program goes way back when Rumsfeld and Myers and Franks set out the goals and objectives of the war plan.
So they are the three people at the Pentagon who decided that this was the thing to do?
They are the three who had the greatest influence on having it done.
What about yourself?
There are literally hundreds of people, myself included, who are big advocates of robust coverage for all the obvious reasons. There are people in every one of the services, the Joint Staff, Captain T. McCreary, Brian Whitman, who works for me. We've always been big backers and promoters of this. It never would have happened in this fashion or in this robust manner if it had not been for the leadership.
But explain to me why the embedding of journalists took place. In other words, it's one thing to want to have a lot of coverage and expose a lot of the leaders of the Pentagon to the press and therefore the public. But why embedding? How'd you get to that?
Well, if you went back and did lessons learned from previous conflicts, and one of the things we say, which is very true, is no conflict is the same. Afghanistan was not like the Persian Gulf War. Persian Gulf War wasn't like Vietnam. We knew whatever we would face, it also would be different than anything we had faced before. But we did go back and do lessons learned from the military's perspective, from the journalist's perspective. And we met with literally hundreds of correspondents, bureau chiefs, news organizations, and said, what's worked and what hasn't in the past. One of the things everybody seemed to say about the Persian Gulf War was, well, there was some media over there, but they pooled them. They had very small numbers, and they tried to depend on a pool system, or they got them there, but then it was very hard for them to get the product back. Couldn't transmit your stories, couldn't file your stories, those sorts of things. So we took those lessons on board and said two things. You need as many journalists as possible, given the size and scope of what a conflict like this might be, and you also needed to ensure, to the extent possible, they could get their products back. So those are the two things we focused on. But having people as close as possible is going to give you the most real, the most genuine look at what the military is trying to do. It's actually a pretty simple concept.
And what was in the back of all of your minds when you thought about the embedding? Was it to win the support of the American people that this would be the best way of doing it? In other words, what was the central reason that you went this way?
There are actually several central reasons. Again, a lot of us, including the Secretary and the Chairman and General Franks, believe it's the right thing to do. As I have said before, preamble to the Constitution calls for the common defense, and the First Amendment is about freedom of the press. I don't think it's an accident, their priority in those two documents. I don't think that's an accident at all. So we think it's the right thing to do. We also think the best way to maintain public support over the long haul is for people to have as much information about what their military is doing, what we're trying to accomplish, how we're going about doing it. So we think it's very practical in that sense. And we also knew it's not just the Iraqi regime, it's a lot of the kinds of threats and challenges we face around the world. Very often, the opponents we go up against are incredibly good at lying and cheating and deceiving. The Iraqi regime spends hundreds of millions of dollars on their disinformation. And you take the lies and the deception, you couple it with technology, which is just phenomenal. And that's one of the things I hope comes out here today. The volume and velocity of information of all kinds going around the world is pretty extraordinary. That's a real advantage for liars. And so we knew we wanted to counter that. And then we also knew from a very practical military perspective. We knew, because it has been the pattern of behavior, Saddam Hussein and his ilk would put civilians next to military assets, would put military assets in neighborhoods, would deliberately put civilians at risk. And it's one thing for Tori Clark to stand up at the podium and truthfully say that. It is a far better thing for the world to see, thanks to the news media, him doing that. And we've seen it. It has not been us up there saying it as much as it's been the news media reporting the attacks on civilians by the Iraqi forces.
So tell us, what have been the advantages so far as you see it with the embedding?
I was saying earlier, it's hard, from my perspective, there is so much going on and there's so much information. I can't honestly say I've got great perspective. But I do think, pure and simple, people are seeing up close and personal what it is the military, the U.S. military and the coalition forces are trying to accomplish. They're seeing how dedicated they are, how disciplined they are. You see the care and compassion with which they treat civilians, with which they treat the POWs. It's pretty extraordinary. So I think that's good. I also think the contrast, how we treat people versus how the Iraqi regime treats people. Again, news media from around the world are showing the world just what it is this regime is doing. That's pretty extraordinary.
So your sense right now about the embedding experiment is that it's a good one and it's working?
Right. I'd push back on you on the word experiment. It's an evolution, it's a continuation, it's an enhancement of what we've been doing for a long time.
And you think the next war will be covered in the same way?
Who knows what the next war might be? Who knows?
Can you imagine this? Hang on a sec, Bill. I am going to get to you in a sec. Is this something that you can imagine, given what you know about it now, would be stopped if, for example, there were 10 problems such as Geraldo Rivera's?
Oh, I doubt it. Again, the overwhelming majority of the experiences have been very good.
Okay. Bill Plant, you've been covering a couple of wars in your time. Would you like to be an embedded journalist? We can send you there immediately.
I'm not so sure it's a bad idea. I mean, which is a way of saying I think it's a good idea. If we had had today's technology tools when you and I covered Vietnam, and your brother, who I guess is here.
He's here.
We would have been able to do similar things. But then ask yourself, what about some of the things we saw in Vietnam? I don't think this has been put to the test just yet. I don't think you've yet had the case of the reporter who is present with gear, maybe television, maybe not, but let's say television, when a terrible mistake is made, a stupid order is given, things which the American military would rather not have the American public see may happen. These kinds of things happen in wars. This is no reflection on the American military, but these kinds of things do happen. They happened in Vietnam a lot. It was a very difficult place, partly because of that, and partly because we couldn't get any information. So I applaud the fact that journalists are able to go. I mean, we'll get to the whole Stockholm Syndrome business and whether or not you become a captive of the people you cover and get severe clientitis. I know we'll get to that. I applaud the idea. I don't think we've yet seen how it will work when really get to the crunch.
Have you guys thought about that at the Pentagon?
Oh,
no
sure.
doubt?
In the briefing papers, the deck that we used as we were building this program, there were several pages on the obvious things. And there were 3 or 4 pages, not quite single-spaced, but 3 or 4 pages with all the things that could go wrong and things that could go badly. And one of them, and I don't know if I would put it in the category of things that would go wrong, one of the realities is that given technology, it is quite possible that people could see someone badly hurt or killed on live television. And I promise you, there are plenty of critics of this program for different reasons, including that one. And I was asked about it a lot, not in the Pentagon, but I was asked about it a lot. And they said, well, how can you support or endorse this program knowing that? And I said, bad things happen in wars. People get killed. People get injured, bad things happen. That's why we try so hard to avoid wars. I happen to think it's truthful. It could be shocking, it could be terrible. I can't predict with certainty what the reaction would be after the fact. I think it would depend on the circumstances. Again, what we've seen thus far, and it's actually been for more than the 11 or 12 days that we've been at war, because many of them were embedded beforehand. The experiences.
That was good. That was great publicity for the military, wasn't it?
It was a chance for people to get used to having each other around, is a way to put it. People have had so many good experiences, and the military, for instance, has seen journalists exercising restraint. There was an incident recently in which some U.S. soldiers were killed, and there was a photograph, in my opinion, was very thoughtfully and respectfully done, and then the soldier was covered up. And the photographer clearly had made a choice, I'm sure he has photographs of other things, But he had made a choice, and his editors had made a choice out of respect for the families, and we've made a real appeal on this front, because next of kin notification can take some time. They chose not to show a photo that would identify that soldier. So we've seen some examples of people exercising what I think is a really appropriate, responsible attitude.
David Sanger, do you support the idea of the embedded journalist? How do you think it's going? What kind of problems do you see, if any?
Well, as a reader, I found it particularly fascinating because it does give you a slice, and it is only a slice, as Secretary Rumsfeld said last week. The criticism that I've heard of it so far has been obviously the Stockholm Syndrome issues that Bill raised, and the concern that as a result, the embedded journalists don't give you an overview of the war. And this is war in particular, I find very difficult one to get a full overview of, even if you're not embedded. And I think that confuses the purpose here. I think the purpose, as Ms. Clark put it so well, was to give people the view of this slice, which is fine as long as it's not the only form of journalism you have, as long as you have people back at the command headquarters, and you have people in Qatar, and you have people here in Washington. And I think that readers and viewers are smart enough to understand the difference and to know that you get a certain value out of seeing a very on-the-ground microscopic view, but that even that company that they're with or that division they're with, if you go back that far, may not have an overview of how the overall war is going.
But at the same time, there are journalists who are not embedded, whose responsibility may be to provide that overview.
That's right.
So the public is getting the overview.
And I think that the trick for us is to keep the mix right. And I think so far people have done that quite well. There has been one chilling moment I saw in our own paper this weekend, which was a fascinating piece that one of our correspondents who's embedded did about the snipers, and quoted one who, an American military, who had taken a shot and killed a civilian along the way, or at least struck a civilian, and said to our reporter the chick was in the way. And, you know, it was a bit chilling, but it gave you a view of what was happening on the ground, but also the incredibly life and death decisions that have to be made in a split second in that kind of situation. I don't think you would have gotten that without somebody who was embedded, unless the reporter happened to be in the right place at the right time.
A question, Tori, that I just thought of listening to David. You were saying before that it was the same leadership of the Pentagon that decided to keep the press at bay during the Afghan war. That turned around and led to the embedding of journalists during the Iraq war. Now, suddenly it occurred to me that that doesn't sit right. Why?
Well, because your assessment's wrong, with all due respect. There's a little bit of an urban legend that there was no coverage of Afghanistan. Military operations in Afghanistan started on October 7th of '01. Military operations on October 7th were coming off ships, were airdrops of humanitarian assistance, were bombers, those sorts of things. There were no U.S. forces on the ground. The United States government had a small handful of people operating literally onesies and twosies, as we call it. But on October 7th, we had, I think it was about 4 dozen members of the media on ships with the planes delivering humanitarian assistance, those sorts of things.
But those reporters say they were really very far from the action itself.
Well, that was the action. Now, if they wanted to be on the receiving end of those strikes, that's a different matter. But the military action, no, it's very important because it's true. The military action was those planes taking off and delivering those weapons on targets in Afghanistan. The action was the planes coming off the ships where we had
let me
people.
take you then to the time that U.S. forces were on the ground.
Sure. There were
At that time, the journalists were kept even a football field away. Something was happening. And the reporters say, and many of them have said this, that they could not get to that action. They were kept away by American troops.
Well, again, just trying to correct the record, and we could find the reporters who were there. We didn't put any significant numbers of forces on the ground in Afghanistan until about the 2nd or 3rd week of November. Up until that time, and we actually counted, There were more news media on the ground in Afghanistan than there were U.S. forces. When the first numbers of U.S. forces went into Afghanistan in November, the media were with the first wave. They were with the first wave, and then almost completely from that point on, there was unilateral coverage throughout Afghanistan.
Okay.
So it's a bit of a urban legend.
Urban legend, okay. Urban warfare, whatever. Tom Walzine, you wrote an article for, I think, TV Guide in 1980. You make that point. As you look back upon it now, what is your sense, because when you were at NBC, you had a lot to do with technology, I remember. What is your sense of the way in which the new technology, this new generation, has affected the coverage of the war?
It's given us a great sense of snippets, but the real journalism is a combination of both. It's the snippets, it's the anecdotal, but it's putting that anecdotal information in a context. And the key here is how you build a context out of all these disparate pieces, including out of a country that you don't have people in, except for Mr. Burns from the New York Times, doing a brilliant job. But there's very, very little coverage out of Iraq to help put that side of it together. But it's that challenge of putting the video, putting the technology in context that I think is going to develop here over time.
Bill Plant. Peter Arnett was fired today. 3 organizations had the privilege. Why do you think he was canned?
I think because he chose to say what he said on Iraqi state television, which is perceived, and I think rightly so, as a propaganda tool of the Saddam Hussein government.
Was it anything that he said specifically that
Yes,
led to his getting fired?
I think it was.
What did he say?
He said, our reports about civilian casualties here, about the resistance of the Iraqi forces, are going back to the United States. It helps those who oppose the war when you challenge the policy to develop their arguments. That was
If
one
he had
thing.
said that on NBC, would it have been canned?
No,
So
absolutely
what's
not.
the difference here, that he appeared on Iraqi television?
Well,
That's the key difference.
they're on the other side. I think that would be the difference.
But the reason to be fired is that he appeared on the other side.
I think that's right. And I think he did
And
it.
if he appeared on Al Jazeera, which is sort of in the direction of the other side,
On Al Jazeera, maybe he wouldn't have to be fired.
he would not have to be fired.
Supposing he had been interviewed by a journalist on Al Jazeera instead of a government functionary,
Right.
which seemed to be the case on Iraqi television, and he had expressed this opinion. Would you fire him? I wouldn't. Not under those circumstances. But appearing on the government television station, being interviewed by someone who could probably not, by any standard usually employed on this side of the water, be called a journalist.
Okay.
I think that's the difference.
No, fair enough. David Sanger, when a new feature of the coverage of this war also is the kind of the homogenization of reporters. A reporter for the New York Times can appear on CBS, on the NewsHour at PBS, Late at Night with Charlie, whatever his name is. And, no, seriously, I do know his name. What is your sense? Does like John Burns, does the New York Times reporter in Baghdad who appears on 3 or 4 different networks, in addition to writing marvelous copy for the Times, is there any problem with that in your mind? Do you know whether he gets paid for appearing on all of these different programs and networks?
The Times has some arrangements with a few organizations. I mean, we have an informal arrangement with the Lair NewsHour, for example. So you'll frequently see Times reporters on that outlet. You know, we're in an era now where you have to be able to take your reporting and shape it for a number of different ways of transmission. And obviously the newspaper is one of them, and the web and the website is another, and we've used our website to update the paper. And you know, we do in normal times, but obviously it's getting a lot more attention now. And I think television is another way to do it, as long as you're sure the environment is right. And you want to make sure
What do you mean the environment?
that you want to make sure that you are picking a program that that enables you to continue your role as an objective reporter and not in
Iraqi television.
not in a propaganda. I suspect that most newspapers would have a problem if their correspondents were going on Iraqi television or any other state-run organ that was not, as Bill put it, a journalistic endeavor. And so I think, these are moments where using good judgment makes a big difference.
Tom Walzine, talk to us a little bit about the cost of this war. How much are networks laying out to cover the war, and how much, at what point do you envisage the guy running the network is going to, or the gal running the network, thank you, is going to say, whoops, this thing is beginning to cost us too much?
A little bit of history, Marvin. First of all, I was talking to one of my friends who was at ABC News doing the accounting at ABC News. He's back in the Gulf War, and $41 million for the 7 months of the Gulf War, $20 million for the 7 weeks. About $450,000 a day was the run rate. Wow. Now you have to put that in the context of what these companies together bring in as revenue. We've got to remember these are from the TV side. These are huge conglomerates. Viacom, CBS. That's why you had to do that thing at the beginning for the SEC. The NBC, GE, ABC, Disney, Fox, News Corp. All are part of big companies. So I added up the revenues in the last fiscal year. Forget GE, which was huge. For the four, AOL, Disney, AOL was CNN, Disney, News Corp, and Viacom, $105 billion of revenues. That would fund the...
Is that a B?
That would do it.
That's a B.
B billion, B billion. I think that's somewhat even bigger than the request for the war. Anyway, about $8 billion in pre-tax. So let's say that the news division budgets are increased by an additional 10%, $40 to $60 million for a war that goes on, say, for another month at most. That's maybe 3% against the pre-tax earnings. That's real money to shareholders, but it's not horrific. These companies can sustain that. And in fact, in my clientele, which are the analysts and portfolio managers of large mutual and pension funds, I have not got one call from anybody saying, oh my God, what's going to happen to Viacom with what CBS is doing? What's going to happen to AOL with what CNN is doing? I've got dozens and dozens of calls from reporters saying, oh my God, what's going to happen? So the investor base, the institutional investor base is not having, at this point, an issue with it. What they do worry about, and we've sort of passed it for the moment, was mass preemptions. The September 11th, post-September 11th type of preemptions where just all the commercials went off the air for a sustained period of time, and then advertisers didn't want to come back on afterwards. And these companies, the broadcast networks, bring in something like about $7 or $8 million a day in their advertising. So you can see how that would add up pretty quickly. But because of the rolling start to the war, we saw basketball back on the Thursday night. The NBC had its Thursday night block on. Disney got its Academy Awards in. So that has not been an issue here.
So do they end up losing money, the networks?
Oh yeah, it costs them.
It does cost.
It will cost them. It will cost them. But in the scheme of companies that bring in hundreds of billions of dollars in revenues, that cost is clearly their cost of doing business. It's the cost that they have to pay to use the airwaves and the public right of way.
But Tom, now you're being logical. Put yourself in the position of the person who makes this call at ABC or NBC or CBS, and you see that your numbers are going down in that limited arena. When the next war comes up, how are you going to look at that?
I guess the question is how long until the next war? Unfortunately, journalism to great degree is journalism by exception. If war becomes the norm, in other words, if this conflict goes on for a long time, then the coverage slowly scales back. There's less support. The dollars going out will be less, partially because perhaps there's less interest or less time on the air to fill, but also because people get better at it or they figure out which reporters they feel they really need. You could keep running at this level forever, but if people would rather watch Friends than watch the war special, there's going to be a natural inclination to pull back.
If this is all taking place, Tom, in an atmosphere of general economic uncertainty, how then would it be regarded within the networks or the newspapers for that matter?
The greater issue, I think, for the network companies, for all media companies now, is what the war, the impact on a macro level the war has on the economy, has on oil prices, ultimately how that ripples into auto sales, how then Detroit reacts in terms of the advertising it buys, what 2004 looks like as an economy, because it's the revenue side, much more than a few extra tens of millions of dollars of news costs. It's the revenue side that really hits the bottom line of these companies.
That's fascinating to me. The connection between money and patriotism is something that has been on my mind for a while, and there was a very interesting story in the New York Times today about Clear Channel Communications. Now, for those of you who may not know a great deal about Clear Channel, it is it's not a new company, but within the last 8 years, it has gone from controlling 43 radio stations to controlling 1,200 radio stations, making it by far the biggest distributor of radio information and information and entertainment. Now, according to the Times, it is encouraging patriotic stories and rallies while cutting back on the coverage of that entertainment or cutting back on the coverage of entertainers deemed to be anti-war. So here you have a huge corporation which has a great deal to do with what you hear on the radio in this country, taking an essentially, in quotes, patriotic approach to the way in which it manages its business. Now, there is absolutely, I don't want to be misunderstood here, there's absolutely nothing wrong with patriotism, even excessive patriotism. But put within the context of journalism and the distribution of news that is clean and fair and somewhat detached, is this not a potentially worrisome phenomenon, David?
I'm troubled at any moment when you begin to believe that news judgments are being made because of some overall corporate viewpoint about whether an event was good or bad. And it needn't be war, it could be business coverage, it could be political coverage.
Right.
And I think that the trick here, and it's very difficult in wartime because people's passions get obviously much more engaged. It's very difficult at times to remind people that you have to go back to the fundamental news values that we all grew up with and that we were all trained with. And those are values that may not be questioned as much when the issues are not life and death. So,
But the issues are life.
But when the issues are life and death, I think it's particularly important we come back to them. So, we discussed before some operational security issues. I don't know any journalists, at least who I deal with from day to day, who have any problem holding out news that could affect the lives of soldiers who are out there.
And I think Tory Clark made that point before, that in the overwhelming number of cases, there is not a problem in the sense of the coverage of war.
I think that one can do that and have no difficulty then turning around and writing very tough pieces about the policy, whether it was the pre-war policy of whether we let
with the New York
on
Times, David.
Right.
The New York Times is a wealthy, prominent, magnificent newspaper. And Arthur Sulzberger, who was sitting right here a month ago, pledged that the New York Times would provide as much money as needed to cover the war, no matter how long the war went on. He said that. So I take him at his word. What I'm worried about is not the New York Times. I'm worried about the smaller newspaper, the middle newspaper, the middle or smaller radio station that is so fragile in an unstable economy that it may have to move with public opinion rather than with a professional judgment of news.
Would you put Clear Channel in that category? I mean,
I don't know. Clear Channel,
that doesn't seem to quite fit the...
No, Clear Channel it's a different thing. Clear Channel has many 1,200 radio stations, and a lot of them deal with just music. But when you keep a musician off the air, because that musician may disagree with war policy, that raises a question. Bill Plant, you wanted to...
A couple of points. Our critics believe that there are corporate influences in everything we do in the news division in any case. Critics from all sides think that we cut and trim because of corporate considerations. And now that there is an instance when it is demonstrated that this is being done, it certainly doesn't help the case for the rest of us. And point two, small operations, newspapers, radio stations are always under advertiser pressure, particularly if they're locally owned, but even if they're not, even if they're part of a big corporation. I mean, the New York Times and CBS can stand up to pressure, and David and I never have to face it because there are people who do that. But if you're the news reporter on a very small radio station in a very small town, and the boss doesn't want you to say that the local car dealer is gouging on his financing, that's your job.
Or doesn't want you to say that the war is not going well, and therefore you appear to be less than patriotic.
Yeah.
And if you do appear to be less than patriotic, it becomes a kind of problem. Secretary Rumsfeld, Tory Clark, has been right up front, and he has been as accessible, I think you're absolutely right, as any Secretary of Defense has ever been. But in the last couple of days, not that he's cut back on access at all, but in the last couple of days he has spoken about the 24/7 cycle of news as if he's worried about the impact that that cycle has upon public opinion and upon public perceptions of the war. How deeply is he concerned about that? Or you?
We'll talk about him first.
Okay.
I think what he was trying to do is, one, just explain what's going on. And it's pretty obvious to a lot of people, not so obvious to others. There's a lot of information out there. And I think it's more of a challenge for the networks and the cable networks than it is for the print organizations. What do you put on? When do you put it on? How do you bring that filter to it, or how do you bring that context to it? It's harder for the networks who are competing 24/7 in that kind of environment. So he was just trying to express reality. And if you listen carefully to his words, he wasn't just talking about the media, he was talking about people as well. There are plenty of people who sit down on K Street and do the Monday morning quarterbacking. Just sit, just take a breath, step back, think about the overall context, think about the overall picture. Don't be overwhelmed one way or the other by one piece of information or one slice of that picture of what is going on. So I think he was just trying to help explain what's going on out there. It is different, but we're in a different kind of war and a different kind of time.
How does it affect decision-making in a 24/7 cycle? I mean, when you are pounded by questions every hour of the day based upon something that has just happened, do you have a chance to think about an answer?
Well, very often we've had experiences in the last week where Pentagon correspondents will come running in the office and they'll say, hey, we just saw on Name a Network that such and such has happened. What can you tell us? Can't tell them anything. And you got to be honest enough to say that, because the reporters are often reporting things in real time, in live time. And you just have to be honest enough and gutsy enough to say, don't know. I'm sure it'll sort itself out. You also have to have confidence in the plan, which a lot of us have, because we've been part of the process since the very beginning. If you know how this is structured, if you know how it is structured to scale up or scale down and be flexible, then you're not as easily buffeted by the herky-jerky of minutes and hours, if you will.
So the fact that he has mentioned the 24/7 cycle so many times in the last couple of days is not a reflection that it's bothering him.
You know, it's often, people are so, with good reason, obviously I'm biased, he's just such a straightforward guy and he's such a straight shooter. People in this country follow him, and they follow his words and they follow his briefings. We have people who call up all the time and say, can you tell me what time he's briefing, what time will be on? So we often get questions like that. Well, why did he say something 3 or 4 times? And they're thinking there's some big theory and some big strategy to it. He's generally answering a question. He generally is answering a question, and that is what he's talking about at the given time. I think there are people in news organizations trying to figure out how to deal with this. Again, I'm not in your business. I think it's easier for print than it is for television, but I think they're trying to figure out, what do we do with these massive volumes of information?
They are trying.
I had plenty of people from news organizations say to me they thought their biggest challenge was going to be technology. New technologies, what's going to work, what's not. There was some Swedish transmission device everybody was buying, but they had no idea if it would work or not. And I'm betting they are surprised at how much of it is getting back and in what time frame.
Bill Plant?
Here's an anecdote that may prove instructive in the current context. In one of the Murrow biographies, I think it's Joe Persico's, he describes how Murrow was with Patton's army during the liberation of Germany and went to Buchenwald. Murrow waited 3 days to file because, in his own words, he wanted to gain some perspective. Imagine that.
Today you would take all of 3 seconds before you'd file. Murrow was also the guy who listened to President Roosevelt talk about the result of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor without any ground rules imposed on Murrow. And he did not go to the studio to broadcast. What he did was he went back to his hotel and he wrote later that he wanted to think about the awesomeness of what it is that the president had just told him. And you wonder in today's context what it is that the modern journalist is going to do. In 1968, I remember Secretary of State then, Dean Rusk, turning to John Scali, who was the ABC correspondent, because Scali had raised a question that sort of raised a larger question about policy. And Russ looked at him and he said, "John, whose side are you on?" And he admitted later that he had spent the better part of the year on aspirin and scotch in order to get through that part of the Vietnam War. But the burden that is placed on decision makers is much more than the burden that is placed on the journalist. And I want to raise a question with David Sanger of the New York Times. Do you think that in the world in which we live today, the post-9/11 world, where governments have to rethink strategy, plan for what the president has called a war against terrorism that may go on for years, that journalism ought to begin to look deep within itself to find out whether the instinctive skepticism that greets most governmental statements ought not to be changed into a greater acceptance of what it is that the government is saying. In other words, that journalists work more closely with the government to advance what could be called the nation's best interests.
I don't think so, because it would require us to make a decision in that case about what is in the nation's best interest, and I don't think that we are here as...
As an American citizen, you make that decision all the time.
But as a journalist, you have to distinguish what your role is. And your role is to do 2 things, unless you're a columnist, if you're in the opinion business, which Bill and I are not. That doesn't mean we don't have opinions, but it means you have to know how to separate them out. And I think you put your finger on just the right issue, which is we are living in an era where there is a massive change underway in how the United States government is examining the threats that face us today. This gets into the debate about what kind of war this is. Is it a preemptive war, which is what the president would have us think? In other words, a war to cut off an imminent threat. And that is something that in history has treated fairly well, that countries can step in and do that. Or is it a preventive war, which is to say a war when we are strong and our opponent is weak because you fear that your opponent could gain strength. And history has not treated preventive wars terribly well over time, because frequently they have become covers for other agendas. And I think one of the important things to do is to be able to step back, Murrow-like, if we ever all had that moment, and we don't, and we probably don't have his wisdom either to do it, and try to place these immediate images in this broader context of what it is that this government is accomplishing.
But when you are on the edge of selecting and writing a story that ends up being, at a rather crucial moment in our history, critical of the government, and you know it, when you can tilt your coverage 3% over to the other side, and you go from 49 to 51 in support of the government. Is that even something that enters a journalist's head, and should it enter a journalist's head?
I'm not sure that that issue is any different from the issues one faced in Vietnam. Now, I didn't cover the Vietnam War. I was a child at the time, but there are many here who were there. Sorry about it.
I mean, isn't that a terrible thing to say?
That was an awful thing to say.
Shocking, shocking.
You know you're going to get gray one day?
It's happened already. But I don't think that issue is any different than the issue that we face today. Because at that time, remember, there were a number of journalists from a number of organizations who were accused of undercutting the government's plan here by the nature of their reporting from Vietnam.
Right.
And in retrospect, it seems like some of them had a pretty good point.
A lot of them had a pretty good point. That is not my point, and that's not my question at the moment. I'm asking whether, Tom Walzine, you used to be a journalist.
Thank you, sir.
I mean, you used to be an honest man. I'm trying very hard to ask the journalists on our panel to focus on the responsibilities of journalism in an age of terrorism. Is it all the same? Are our instincts all the same? Do we respond to government statements in the same way? Are we prepared in any way to give the government the benefit of the doubt?
You got to, the basis of the country and the continuation of the country is the reporting as best as somebody can do and see it based on the facts they have at the time and the presentation of those facts. In a pure world, any skewing one way or the other would not be proper. It's what can I find? Do I make the extra phone call? Do I talk to the extra 3 people? But what can I find and put together? It seems to me that that's what keeps the country going in the future, not a conscious, I'm going to swing it this way or I'm going to swing it that way.
But what I'm almost asking, is there a point at which it might become unconscious? In the same way that there is an unconscious skepticism that is a first reaction of a journalist to a government statement. What about an unconscious reaction of, seems to make sense, let's go that way? Or is it, Bill Plant, in the very nature of our business that we can't do that?
As we do our business, it is in the nature of our business to be adversarial, sometimes confrontational, and we're generally not prepared to give anybody, including government, the benefit of the doubt. And I don't think we should be. I think that there are judgment calls. And I understand the point you're trying to make, but I can't retreat from where I have always been, which is to say that you ask the hard questions first. Sometimes I'll get it wrong. I have ample emails here, people who thought I've gotten it wrong just recently. But I think you have to ask the questions. I don't think that you can skew because of a perceived change in the condition of the country. I think that would provide precisely the opposite effect. Now more than ever.
What would be the opposite effect here?
People would have nothing on which to base their belief that you're at least trying to give them the straight story.
Okay.
Well, let me leap in with just one other observation.
David.
That even if you heard a policy and you thought it made enormous good sense,
Right.
to my mind, you'd be abrogating your professional training and your duty as a journalist if you are not constantly testing what it is you're hearing to find out whether there is a body of thought that makes sense that lies behind it. I mean, Tori could step out and explain why it is that everybody, and she's had to do this most days this past week, why it is that in the view of the government, the war is going exactly as they had planned and expected. And whether we believe that or don't believe it is irrelevant. It's our job to go test that against whatever facts we can put together, whether they are the reports coming from the embeds or whether they are other evidence we have, to figure out whether this is just a statement or whether there is something behind it.
Tory Clark, when you're up before the press corps, either at the briefing or in your office when they come in quite often, are you able to sort of subdivide the press corps into those reporters who are favorable to the administration, those who are against the administration? Do you change your approach to them for any reason because of that?
Not for those reasons. We were talking about this before. We are blessed by having a press corps. Pentagon press corps as a group is better, in my opinion, than any other press corps with which I've dealt in the years. They tend to be people who covered it because they like serious issues, they like sober topics, they take it very, very seriously. They tend to have a deep body of knowledge about the military and the Department of Defense, so that's a good thing. You tend to get educated, well-informed, in my opinion, important questions. Times like these, when there's a lot of activity, just like the early days in the war with Afghanistan, you get some big footers, you get some people who were thrown in there just because their news organizations felt like somebody ought to be there. So you get wild card stuff and you get some chatter that just isn't quite useful, to be perfectly honest. So that's how, when you look out and you see them, and the regulars tend to sit in the regular seats, and so you can try to mix it up. We do try to mix it up, domestic and foreign, to a certain extent, but it's not for or against. It's really more veterans and new people, is how I see it.
Have you seen any changes in the way in which reporters pursue information, dig for information at the Pentagon? Do you find the Pentagon on the other side more willing, perhaps, to provide more information now? I'm not talking about embedded, the guys covering the Pentagon.
The guys covering the Pentagon, again, most of them have been there for so long. We've got some real veterans, and I really mean it. I think some of the best in the business. I won't name them because I'd ruin their careers. So we're very, very fortunate from that. I think they quickly have understood, most of them have understood their role in this era of embedding. Their role, they believe, I think, is to try to bring some of that context and bring some of that perspective and help their news organizations understand what do all these parts and pieces mean. And when you're walking down the street now and you hear somebody say, hey, did you see what the first MEF did today? That's pretty amazing. And I think the Pentagon correspondents are trying to make sense of all the parts and pieces for people.
Bill Plant, in the coverage of Vietnam, for example, and in your understanding about the coverage right now in Iraq, how would you define the basic differences between the two?
First, you have the immediacy that technology provides. We shipped film from Vietnam. It got on the air 2 days later, maybe. Second, there is an increased sense of the up close and personal. We did lots of features which focused on human interest in Vietnam, but it's not quite the same thing as seeing somebody who's just been wounded, somebody who has just or is in the act of taking a prisoner or giving food to a refugee. The very immediacy of it changes the whole picture, it seems to me, because what we saw from Vietnam was, in a sense, already history. And what we see today is present in the moment.
And you mentioned Murrow before having 3 days, desiring 3 days, taking 3 days really, to think through a problem before broadcasting. Can you imagine that happening today? Can you do that today?
No, absolutely not. We have to push the information on as it comes in.
Do you have enough chance to check what you put out?
Well, I do, because I'm not on a live situation that often. I mean, I have the luxury of having several hours to go over a script for an evening news piece or a morning news piece. But someone who is gathering information on the fly has to be very careful, because they don't have a chance to go back and call somebody else and say, what about this?
Tom Woolsey, from the time that you were at NBC in the 70s and 80s, how would you define the biggest difference between then and now?
What Bill's just talking about.
The technology and the speed?
No, yeah, what the technology forces on the reporters and the editors. It's not the technology per se, but it's the process of pushing the information through the system and to the news consumer. And we're actually asking the news consumer to have an awful lot more smarts today than ever before in history.
Do you remember being pressed by any economic concerns when you were at NBC on the pursuit of a news story?
I remember being part of a group that helped figure out what 500 people should go at NBC News one day. After GE came in, it was 1,500 people, and by the end of the day, it was 1,000. I was part of that group, unfortunately. Yes, I remember times that. Actually, the times today are much better than they were in the mid-'80s, when there was the huge change of corporate management and when the realization hit that networks were on their way down. So in a way now, what I was talking about the impact on shareholders and everything, much less today than there was back 10 or 15 years ago, I think.
David Sanger, now 20 years at the New York Times, are you conscious of economic pressures, particularly during wartime?
You know, we are blessed to be remarkably insulated from it. And what you said that our publisher, Arthur Sulzberger, said here is what I've heard him say in internal meetings, which is, there's an important story here, go out and cover it, and let us worry about what it costs later on. And to some degree, I think that is you know, something that is harder and harder to do in the news business these days. But I think it also reflects a recognition that over time, the quality of your product and your own reputation is related to the fact that in the toughest of times, you get out and you devote resources to it, and you try to make it up when things slow down a little bit.
Tori Clark, in a brief couple of seconds. What have you learned about the journalists covering war?
I'm really just seeing what I expected. In my experience in all the different places I've worked is that the majority of the journalists covering whatever topic it might be, the U.S. Trade Representative's office, the White House campaigns, most of them I think try very hard. I think especially when it comes to things military, they understand and appreciate how serious these topics are. They are life or death. So I'm just seeing a lot of what I've seen before, which is some hard-working people trying to do a good job.
Ladies and gentlemen, our time's up. I want first to thank our panelists who have been, I think, outstanding, really taking time out of very busy schedules to come here, and we're all very grateful for that. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the National Press Club, the George Washington University, the Shorenstein Center at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. I want to thank the Knight Foundation for making all of this possible. And finally, I want to thank our wonderful audience. Loyal, absolutely terrific. Thank you very much. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck. Thank you. Thank you.